Welcome back, everybody. We're following the inspiration today. I've got to stop promising that we're going to talk about certain things the following week, because actually I do have to follow whatever's inspired in the moment to chat about. And in this instance, it's inspired by somebody who had bought a flute from me recently, and I saw them. They were kind enough to post me a video of them playing with their new flute with their looping pedal. And I noticed that actually the block must have been quite far back on the flute, so it sounded really airy. So today's motivation, today we're going to speak about getting the best sound out of your Native American style flute, and that leads really importantly into how to maintain the flute, to stop it getting clogged up, to stop it getting mould and damaged, and to give it more longevity. But also that then takes us onto the subject of removing the block and replacing the block on top, and how to tie that on the way that I tie my flutes on when I sell them. So again, it's always an opportunity just to demonstrate or to show my recent flute that I've made. This one is halfway through being made. I've got some decor to put on it still, some pyrography. I've already taken a flamethrower to the branch several times, as you can see, and that will lead us into how I finish that off too. So stay tuned on my Facebook and Instagram if you want to see and hear this one perform when it's all finished. I'm going to break into an analogy here of why we need to maintain our flute, why we need to take off the block, why we need to be conscious of what's going on there. Because yes, Native American flutes are beautiful and brilliant and approachable to learn, because this sound mechanism and how the airflow works within a Native American style flute, I should have said, the sound mechanism helps direct under the block the airflow to cut across the splitting edge or the sound hole, or however you want to phrase that part of the flute, in order to give the sound. So it takes away the need or the requirement to create the correct embouchure with our mouths, like on some of the, maybe a Bansuri flute from India, or shakuhachi from Japan, or one of the end-blown flutes, maybe like the classic ney flute, Turkish ney flutes. They're all end-blown. We don't have this complex configuration of airflow under the block and everything. They're very simple instruments, and they're much harder to play. So that comes at a cost. So I'm going to break to the analogy of buying a new wardrobe. Of course, everybody's heard of the wardrobe analogy. Let's talk about the wardrobe that you've just bought. It's brand new. It smells beautiful, divine, brand new oak furniture, cost an arm and a leg. The last thing that you're going to do with that is open the doors, throw a bucket of water in there with some acid, and then shut the doors and turn the heating on. Because what would happen? It would firstly create a lot of wet and damp wood, which would eventually end up rotting because it hadn't been ventilated. Mold would begin to grow, the wood begins to rot, it begins to swell and disfigure and warp, and it's just not what you want to store your clothes in at the end of the day. But that's exactly what we're doing if we continuously play our Native American style flutes and we don't take this block off, because unavoidably, now people will try and tell you differently, but unavoidably we have, and we do when we express through our breath, a lot of moisture coming through with the breath. That moisture hits the insides. This is the first air chamber here, the slow air chamber. So we blow in through the blowhole, it opens up into the slow air chamber, slows the breath down slightly, and then it goes across this channel here. And this is where we get our flutes wetting out from time to time when we're playing, and we're like, why is the flute not performing? Because the moisture buildup has built up underneath the block and is obstructing this very thin air channel or flue of the flute. And so it stops performing, it gets clogged up, we have to shake the flute out or blow aggressively to displace that moisture buildup, that moisture content from our breath. Now, it doesn't just affect the playing of the flute. If there's that much just coming across the top of the flute, then how much is actually built up on the inside of the slow air chamber? It's not good to play your flute particularly a lot and then not remove this block. And when I go back to the beginning of my own flute, my own journey with flute and buying my flute, I was a bit nervous about moving the block because I knew it was critical to the sound of the flute, getting it well positioned and stuff. So there's a reluctance there that I understand and that I can remember, to removing the block and repositioning the block and letting your flute air out. And because it's hidden, it's out of sight and we can't see, because over time the acid in the breath and the moisture from the breath, it will take time, but it will corrode the inside of the flute and it won't play properly if that happens. You'll have to get it refurbished if it can be saved, and or you know, perhaps just move on to another flute. It won't work properly if we don't maintain it. Now, a well-maintained Native American style flute will last a lifetime. So it's really not an issue as long as we know what we're doing here. As long as we're taking the block off, like I've mentioned, we can get maybe, if you've got some really good quality cotton buds, maybe you can get in there and dry it out, just letting it air out, removing the block, shaking it aggressively, you know, careful not to drop it when you do that. Cry, cry, boo-hoos, smashy, smashy, not good. So make sure you've got a firm grip of it if you're going for the shaking action. Get rid of the moisture out of there, and gently. You can also buy like pipe cleaners. You can put a pipe cleaner in this end and this end and get a lot of the moisture content out of there. And then best stored really with the block off. And then when we come to play, or you might remove the block once in a while, once every week perhaps, or something like that, you know. We can just start with that intention and with the knowledge that it's a practice that's well worth doing if we want to have the flute last that lifetime, rather than 5 to 10 years perhaps, would be the reality if we never removed this little thing. So once we remove it, we dry it, and we come to replace it. And this is where it becomes critical, where we actually place this block. So I'm going to get close in on camera here and show you the effects of having it too far one way or the other. If we want to see here, we've got the sound hole. This is the sound hole. We want the front of this block, this line here in between the two shields, if you like, the front of the block wants to be right at the front edge, closest to your mouth, but on the second hole. This is the actual sound hole. This is the air, the ramp or the air flow, the air channel from one hole to the other. This sound hole, we want the front edge to be in alignment with that hole. And you can see there that it's pretty flush. If I move it more, you can see from directly square on, you can see that it's flush. Now, what happens if we when we say adjust, let's adjust this block, let's adjust it forward for more clarity, or we want to move it backwards to have a more airy sound. So it will affect the sound, and there is a sweet spot. I always try and get mine so they don't really move from their sweet spot when I make flutes. But, you know, they can knock and move and twist and everything in the post, or they can just work themselves loose. And a really great way to tell is if you make sure that you follow these instructions once and you get to used to the sound of your flute, and then perhaps it's more obvious that the block has shifted if it's not quite sounding right. If it's too airy, then maybe the block has shifted backwards like that, and you can see quite clearly that's exaggerated actually, because if you are intentionally adjusting it back for a more airy sound, then probably 1 millimeter will do it. That's back to flush. Let me move this light a second because it's casting a shadow. Let's twist that in there. There, adjusting it down by 1 mil, more airy sound, back to level. If we push it forward, yes, it can get us more clarity, less airiness, but also it might easily overblow and go into the second octave, or the higher octave rather, and sound absolutely dreadful. I'll demonstrate that when I've tied this block on, but it will jump octave, it'll go really, really high pitched. And that's because it's the block you've moved too far forward, or it's worked its way too far forward. So there's a couple of things to bear in mind there and to kind of learn and to get to grips with over time. But a really good starting point for most flutes is to have it flush level with the sound hole. There you go. Let's get on to replacing it then. We need to tie it back on. And also, you know, I do quite a neat job of this with the kind of cord that I tend to supply with my flutes. But in general, no matter whether it's this cord or it's a more kind of a thicker cord or whatever, we look for the midway point. So we're looking for even strands when it's being placed in the center of the tieable part of the block, which is about there. So we have to forget these wings because we're not going to tie over the top of them. So the tieable part of the block, midway, and then you can just pull down, and that's, you know, I can move the flute around now because I've pinched it here. Essentially, it's not going to move. That allows me to start the tying process. One goes one way, the other one the other, obviously. Now this cord isn't cut to length. I haven't got that far with the flute yet. So we'll just go a couple of times in each direction, just pulling tension. Because you've got your finger on the top, you can afford to pull tension, pull it round, get it nice and neat as you can. We can adjust it afterwards, okay? Go past your finger, lift it, replace it. That was the hardest one to do because sometimes before we've developed the knack for that, it can move as we lift. But now there's 2 rounds on there already, less issue with that. Quite easy to pull over, keeping it tight, pull towards, pull over, just keep tension on that all of the time, only ever releasing the tension when you've secured that with your finger. Okay, cool. So 5 times round on that side. Now we've done that, it gets even easier. We can pull this down tight and we can hold it all on that side of the flute. No need for the top finger anymore, really. And no need to catch the thread each time it passes either. It's much tighter, it's much more stable now. We can, you know, even let go there. It was unintentional, yes, but it actually at this stage is less critical, and we can move it and we can pull it tight again. And you're catching it actually with your thumb at the back here, like that. So this is a really handy little demo of how to tie the blocks on that I provide, and the way that I tie my blocks on with this particular cord. There's a lot of other options out there, you know, depending on what flute you've bought from what maker. There's all different types of cord and all that sort of stuff, but this is mine, how I do it. I like that it gives a little neat finish to the flute personally. Fingers on the top there, but doesn't really need to be. I've got the tension here. Now just find the best position, the way that you can work it. I always just jam it between my knees, tie a single, like the beginning of the shoelace, that first move. I never put a knot in my flutes. The knots, they don't really work loose. This will work loose, but you can retie it. But with a knot, it begins to stretch anyway and becomes loose. You're better off really just having it singly tied like that. And if and when, and maybe at the beginning of when you pick the flute up, then just check that's tight. Give it another tug and pull it in a little bit tighter if you need to. You know, like I said, with a double knot in there or with a knot, it will work loose anyway, and then you've got to try and undo the knot. So there's very little point. Now let's get back to demonstrating then what I can't, because you know, I've made this flute such a way that the block won't go too far back. It won't be pushed there because I know that that's optimal sound. So I've finished that. There's a ridge that you can see in there, I think. But it sinks into the flute, so it holds it securely before the tie's even on there, if you like. But it would be an airy sound if it had slipped too far back and too far forward. So let's just demo the fundamental note. So the reason I'm tonguing there is actually it's a bit of a test run for the flute. You should be able to just about tongue gently on the bottom or the fundamental or the deepest note of the flute. Ideally, and some of them are more temperamental than others, particularly with branch flutes, because there's so much that isn't an exact science about the airflow within these. But ideally, that's what you're looking for. And so perhaps if the block has worked its way, it's quite tight, a couple of mil forward, still works, but that's me on the bottom note. I'm not even tonguing now and it's still overblowing. Get the block back into position. Happy days. That's me missing the fingerings. So I hope that's helped. Remember, do not throw buckets of water and keep them in your wardrobe. Please dry out your flutes. Your flutes will last an absolute lifetime. Hopefully that's just a quick bit of basic troubleshooting for people that aren't getting the best sound out of their Native American flute, whether it's from me or anybody else. The block is critical to working. That's doing all the work of the embouchure that you would ordinarily have to do on any other style of flute, unless it's obviously like a whistle or something like that as well. But I hope that's helped. Thank you so much. See you again next week for another, oh my goodness, it's such an exciting video on Native American style flutes.